Outside there is some mangrove plenty in case anyone wants to try some. It's not from Latin America, it is from Florida, but it's kind of an interesting product that comes from mangroves, so I figure people might want to try it. I want to welcome you all and thank you for coming. I'm going to talk about mangrove law and policy in Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia, and also gender and mangrove use and reforestation in Costa Rica. The first part of the presentation is from work that I did in the conservation clinic last fall. A law student, Melissa Dagon, helped me to do some of the research, primarily on the legal framework of Colombia's mangroves. The second part of the presentation uses the context of the first to ask some questions about gendered community mangrove management in Costa Rica. So these are the three questions that I used to think through my three cases. The first part being on the legal framework of the three countries. So how are mangroves managed and access to mangroves managed in international and domestic law? What is the nature of ownership and access to mangroves? And what are the rights of use to mangroves and mangrove areas? So why does the intertidal zone matter? Mangroves are trees that are found in the intertidal zone. The intertidal zone edges marine coastlines, and it's a space that is flooded at high tide and it's dry or exposed at low tide. These spaces are both socioeconomically important, they're also ecologically important. For local users, it's a resource for multiple products, including both timber and non-timber forest products. Mangroves in this zone provide ecosystem services such as coastline stabilization and filtration from land runoff. And they're also spaces that are valued because of local identity. It's a space that's used as alternative economic spaces, like for tourism or for aquaculture. And they're also ecologically important because they provide nursery habitat and protection for a number of marine species, including a number of target species for local fisheries and for subsistence. The tree structures also serve as rookeries and nesting sites for a number of marine and coastal birds. Some of them are migrating birds. And these species are these spaces are also an important source of carbon storage. So as you can see, it's something that's important to a number of stakeholders at a number of different levels. So understanding the use and the value of the resource is important to understand who are the stakeholders at these multiple levels. The importance of mangroves and concerns about mangrove well-being spans local, national, and global levels. Locally, loss of mangroves impacts community and individual livelihoods, and uses can also compete with one another, and they can vary by site. You'll see a lot of photos in the presentation that I took this summer. I took all the photos except for two, which you'll be able to tell very quickly which ones they are. These are the major international treaties that are relevant to the three cases and relevant to mangrove governance in them. It includes the Ramsar Convention, the World Heritage Convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea, and also the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There are some others as well, but these seem to be the most relevant. You may ask yourself what this muddy patch of soil is on the corner. That's the root of a mangrove tree, and if you see in the, does this have a laser? Ooh, maybe you can't see it on there, but I'll point to it. So that little ball-shaped thing in the middle, that's a piangua, which is a shellfish. In all three cases, this is a really important resource from the mangrove. And you'll hear me talk about piangua extraction throughout the presentation. But so you have an idea, that's what it looks like and where it's found. So when extraction takes place, there's some digging involved, a lot of very close searching, and you can imagine that there's some skill level required to find these shellfish. So to understand the legal rights to access, it's important to understand tenure and who owns the bottom. Unsurprisingly, I found that this varies widely by case, and there are exceptions for certain interests and for stakeholders. Mostly, ownership is given to states and local communities have rights to use. There are possibilities for concessions to tourism or aquaculture interests, which I'll go into more detail in a couple of slides. And private interests can challenge legal understandings of ownership and access. And you'll also notice that institutional decision-making for the three cases and the resources in the three cases can vary, and they can overlap greatly, which complicates things even further. That's the Piangua again, but that's a little bit of a better view of it. When operationalizing the word use, many legal documents will refer to wise use as a model, and they'll incorporate goals that should maintain ecosystem benefits and services to ensure long-term conservation of biodiversity and human well-being. This concept of wise use is from the Ramsar International Convention of Wetlands that was signed in 1971. And I just want to highlight on the slide itself. So thinking of wise use as a resource that will, of use of a resource that will ensure the availability of that resource for the future. I have a list here of different uses. They may vary by site, as I mentioned before. So in Costa Rica, you may not have examples of like timber or maybe charcoal, but you may have examples of that in Colombia. This is just a general list, so you have an idea of what are the different uses that come from mangroves. Uses of mangroves in the intertidal zone can vary from extractive to non-extractive use. And mangroves in and of themselves are valued for these uses, but also because of important ecosystem services at the community, national, and international levels. Mangroves can also be sites that are valued for their importance to local identities and culture. So these are some examples of some pictures that I took in the fields. So the first one is an aquaculture site for mussels. This is from the same aquaculture site, but out in the water. This is a form of fishing that we observed. Actually, Tom, you were there too. This is when we went on the kayaking trip in Savegre, I think it was. And this is a structure that's built from mangroves, and people will use that to fish. And then the bottom one is an example of some artisanal fishing from my field site. So the next section is going to highlight some of the specific domestic laws relevant to access, ownership, and use of mangroves in the three case study countries. Before I go to that, I want to point out the differences between extractive and non-extractive use. So extractive, we kind of discussed a little bit throughout: timber, tannins, mollusk, and shellfish extraction. But these non-extractive uses seem to be very much in competition with these extractive ones. And they include recreation and tourism, aquaculture sites, competition of space for agriculture, and also there's some competition of space for changes in infrastructure, and that can be for tourist sites or for transportation. So the first case is Costa Rica. Thinking about how mangroves are managed, the Constitution gives all citizens the right to a clean and healthy environment and an ecologically balanced environment. That's in Article 21 and Article 50. The state is responsible for protecting and maintaining the state's natural beauty and for conserving and developing the cultural heritage of the nation. From the papers that I reviewed, there were no legal indications that gave communities management rights. And despite that, there is some evidence of increased participation of communities and NGOs in monitoring and restoration of many of the sites. And this seems to be because institutional resources are limited. What does ownership and access look like? So in Costa Rica, the first 50 meters from the high tide line is owned by the state, and it's considered to be public property. And islands in and of themselves are also owned by the state. The intertidal zone and mangroves exist in a space that is simultaneously terrestrial and marine, right? They're in that intertidal zone that part of the time is exposed to the air, part of the time is underwater. So there are laws that are both terrestrial and marine that apply to this resource. Mangroves cannot be privately owned, and they also cannot participate in payment for ecosystem services. So all that carbon storage that they do is not something that can be necessarily profited from for a local community, at least not through that scheme. What are the rights to use? The use of mangrove sites for extraction of natural resources can be permitted if they are included in management plans, and outlines for plans include rational or wise use. The issue here is that many sites don't have management plans, and the lack of clarity on the varied uses and the impact of these uses on the resource is also a conflicting issue, right? We don't know how much is out there, how many piangua are out there in each case, because there hasn't been an assessment done for each area. Governing institutions establish management plans with inputs from NGOs and community stakeholders to establish some limits on and regulations on the use. And the next case is Panama. So how are mangroves managed here? Legally, it's considered a marine resource, but contributions to ecosystem services allow them to be considered under forest laws. This is in the forestry law, Article 5. The state must maintain a clean and healthy environment. This is from the Constitution. And development and human well-being have to be ensured. And interestingly, the Constitution also indicates that citizens, along with the state, are both responsible for ensuring ecological health and stability. And government is charged with writing laws that are ensuring the use of land, coastal, and marine fauna is rational and warrants protection and renovation. That's also in the Constitution. So what does ownership and access look like? In Panama, things kind of seem to get a little bit more complicated. From the Constitution, mangroves cannot be privately owned. However, concessions can be granted to tourism and real estate, which can cause some conflict. Administration of mangroves is split among different government agencies depending on where the mangroves are located. So whether or not they're inside of a protected area or outside of a protected area. After 2009, law was passed, Law 80, that indicated that land titles could not be given to territories that included mangroves or protected areas. However, this was not a retroactive law, so anyone that had a land title before 2009 gets to keep the access to it. And the rights of use. In Panama, cutting, use, and commercialization of mangrove forest products or parts is prohibited, except when it's related to tourist development or if it's pre-approved by an environmental impact study. The exploitation of mangrove resources, so the use, the harvesting, or trade in islands is prohibited, again, except when it's involved in tourist development. So the regulation on use still remains a little unclear. I did not take this photo. The next case, the last one, is Colombia. So again, thinking about how these mangroves are managed and how access looks. In Colombia, citizens have a responsibility to protect the cultural and natural resources of the country and to ensure that there's a conservation of a healthy environment. And mangroves, estuaries, and marshes are considered legally worthy of protection. And ownership and access. In Colombia, about 60% of mangroves are zoned and categorized as areas of recovery, preservation, or sustainable use. And Colombia has an interesting dynamic within it that the other countries don't include. They have resguardos, which are collective property title. So a group such as an indigenous group or traditional Afro-descendant community can own lands collectively, and this land can protect their territory, cultural, and political autonomy. This is relevant because if mangroves are within those territories, certain activities are allowed. So for example, the use of mangroves for charcoal and for firewood is prohibited, but they can be allowed for groups that are living within these resguardos and have traditionally used these resources. So overall, legally understanding and outlining mangrove use and the protections of it is really complicated. It varies widely by place, even within country. It's multi-leveled, it's riddled with competing interests, many stakeholders, and it falls within multiple or overlapping jurisdictions. So there can be terrestrial and marine laws that apply, the Ministry of Fisheries can be involved, but also the Ministry of Agriculture, etc. So I want to tie this all to my own research. So my research involves gender, and I want to go ahead and align this, align what I just talked about with Ramsar's view on gender, and also thinking forward to I guess thinking about connecting everything to what's coming up as the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So in aligning to the Sustainable Development Goals, Ramsar has highlighted the inclusion of gender in their convention. And they do this by recognizing that women play a role as agents of development, realizing that gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls is crucial to making progress across Sustainable Development Goals, highlighting the inclusion of men and women, emphasizing gender equality and women's empowerment, and also recognizing that women play a crucial role in the provision, management, and safeguarding of wetlands. So I ask, as we prepare to enter the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, how does participation, community mangrove management, and reforestation empower men and women on Isla de Chira, Costa Rica? To understand this, I looked at gendered community involvement, partner influences, and community perceptions. And also, I included these categories and these questions within the categories. So under community, gendered community involvement, have women been targeted to lead? How do men and women participate in mangrove use? And how do men and women participate in restoration? For partner influences, I'm thinking partners as like outside of the island. Has one gender been prioritized for training and capacity building? Who in the community has received training? And under community perceptions, what is the community's perception, men and women, of these trainings? And what are the community perceptions about the process and results of restorations? These are my methods. So I use archival examination, participant observation, I did some semi-structured interviews, and I facilitated a community meeting with mapping. For my archival examination, I looked at forest cover maps, reports from the environmental ministries in Costa Rica, and also from conservation groups that were working on the island. My participant observation included a homestay. I stayed with a family for the duration of my research. I volunteered in daily work, so I participated in fishing activities. I went out and collected piangua. I visited different aquaculture sites, and I did home activities and went to church with my family, and I took field notes and photography. My interviews were semi-structured, so I did some purposive sampling of presidents of associations in each of the areas that I'm going to talk about. And I included snowball sampling of people that were associated and non-associated. And when possible, I also spoke with individuals that were from the partner organizations and some individuals that were in the ministries of environment that were involved as well. I included a Likert scale for a few of my questions. So participants were asked to rate things from 1 to 5, 5 being the highest and 1 being the lowest. And I'll talk about this in a little more detail later. And I also did some free listing. And in my community meeting, I facilitated a dialogue, which I will also talk about with a little more detail, in which we discussed values of mangroves and memories that they had associated to mangroves. And then we did a mapping activity where the community drew out their community, and they identified spaces that they thought were gendered. So they might designate one area as being a more masculine space, one area as being a more feminine space, or neither or both. And together, the community in a large group did a reconstruction of their history with mangrove restoration. So they did a timeline. For my conceptual framework of analysis, I'm using Kabir's framework for women's empowerment. And for my research, I'm using it to look at both women and men's empowerment. And it's important to note that power isn't a shared resource. So when one group is more empowered, it doesn't mean that another group is less empowered. Although there can be loss of empowerment when one group is denied access to a resource. So using this framework, I'm thinking about how access to resources are opening opportunities for agency. So resources can be anything from economic, social, ecological, knowledge, agency. I have to thank Becky Williams because we talked about this very thoroughly recently, and that influenced the slide a lot. Agency is the ability to be and to do, so the ability to make decisions or to participate. In this case, participation is something that I looked at very closely, and that would lead to empowerment or disempowerment or less empowerment. Next, I'm going to share some of the preliminary results based on an analysis of still in progress. So this is a work in progress still. But I want to show you a little bit about what Isla Chita is. So Isla de Chita is in Costa Rica. It's in the Gulf of Nicoya, which is this little square that's over here. And it's that tiny island all the way at the top. It's at the mouth of the Rio Tempisque. So there's a river that opens into this gulf, leading to that estuary environment where these mangroves are hopefully thriving. This square here is a little bit of a closer view of the Gulf. All this gray patch that you see is where there are mangroves. So you can see on the island there's quite a bit. This is a closer view. The light blue area is where there are mangroves on the island. And there are a few different small communities or neighborhoods. So for my research, I grouped them into 3 sites based off of the 3 different mangrove restoration projects that were there. So the first one is the Palito area, which is down here. The next one is Montero, which is in the top northwest corner. And the last one is Bocana. So these are some of the memories and values that came out of that opening discussion at the community meeting. And I wanted to share some because I think that they capture how people perceive their relationship with the mangroves. So in the previous presentation, so remember this is in 2 parts, we talked at length about use, but I also want to point out that value is important to understanding communities' connections to a resource and the importance of access. During the community meeting, I asked participants to share a memory that they had about the mangroves and something that they thought was valuable about them. And these are some of the responses that they gave. So I went one day with my family to the mangrove to extract pianguas. My sister got stuck in the mangrove. It was a day filled with laughter and delicious food. We went as a family to extract piangua, and we would eat them in the mangrove. We'd take tortillas or rice, and we would prepare ceviche from piangua. I learned to extract piangua when I was 7 years old. And some of the values that people gave, many people depend on the resource to feed their families. Others pass on that legacy to their children and grandchildren. The mangrove is an economic and cultural resource. I think it's important that there are many animals and people who depend on the resources that it contains. So as you can see, mangroves are spaces that are closely tied to identities as women and men, identities as fishers and extractors. They contribute to a cultural identity as Chileños. They're valued as a source of subsistence, a place of recreation, a place to develop special knowledge, and an activity that strengthens kinship networks. It's seen as ecologically and economically important. And this is a picture of the activity itself, so people posted up and then shared and discussed what they posted. And a lot of them found that they had memories that were very similar. They had ideas about the mangroves that were pretty common amongst them. Participants also created maps of their community spaces, and they identified areas that they considered to be feminine, masculine, both or neither. Mangroves and extractive sites were identified as being associated with mujeres, or women, and being feminine, and fisheries were identified as being masculine, along with bars and soccer fields. In Bocana, boats and neighborhood restaurants were shared spaces, schools were shared spaces, or they were viewed as genderless, and association gathering spaces were also seen as shared space. So thinking back about the questions, for the first sub-question, how do men and women participate in mangrove use? When asked to free list, the participants, so 52 participants, listed cultivation of mussels, cultivation of oysters, extraction of clams, extraction of piangua, fishing, peanut and hibiscus farming, reforestation and restoration, and tourism. So of the 52 responses in Palito and Montero, most men mentioned fishing. Men listed this more than women as their primary activity. And of the 52 responses, women in Palito and Montero most mention activities involving mollusk extraction as the activity that they most participate in. However, 75% of women said that they participated in more than one activity, and 70% of men included more than one activity as well. Some men reported that they were extractors, and some women also reported that they were fishers, or both. The heavy association with women involved in extraction and the heavy association of men involved in fishing supports this idea that each gender may hold some special knowledge about each activity and each space. So it seems to make that transition for extractors into reforestation project participants seem like it's likely, or I don't like to use this word, but it almost seems like it would be natural. And when asked what they thought, when asked why they thought that women participated in extraction, one response described the work in the mangrove as being more flexible for a busy woman. It was on shore, it could be accessed on foot, no special tools were necessary, and she could bring her children with her. So thinking about the next two questions, so how do men and women participate in restoration, and whether or not women have been targeted to lead. These are some pictures from the different restoration sites. The first one on the top left is from the Montero site. They have a nursery there. The second one is from the Bocana site. There's also a nursery there. Each of these sites, when the projects were started off with a number of participants. That one, I believe, it started off with about 20 people. This one may have started off with like 12. The first site only has 6 people working in it now, one of which is a man. The second site only has 1 person working in it now. And this bottom picture is a reforestation site from a Palito project that no longer exists. So the first reforestation project on the island was in Palito. And that site was started by the community itself. It was started by a group of women working in oyster aquaculture. And later, after about 2 years, a conservation group who was working with the fishing association in that community decided to round up a group of people to do some reforestation on a nearby smaller island that was a fishing site. It's called Isla Paloma. And in that site, there was a little bit of a different dynamic for the work that was to be done. Because it was on an island that was unprotected or unsheltered from the wind and the waves, there was a lot of very heavy wave action and a lot of strong currents and tides. So a seawall needed to be built around the reforestation site, and around each propagule, there needed to be, the propagule is like the baby mangrove, right, the little seedling. There needed to be like a little mini seawall built around it to protect it from those strong currents. And this work was viewed as being very labor intensive, very hard to do, so only men were recruited to do this project. I did not take this picture. This is an old picture, and it comes from this report that was released in 2018. So as you can see, these are the small little mounds that were built out of rocks, and all the participants that participated at this site were men. I did interview a few of these men. But this ended up causing a little bit of tension in that community. And after this project was done, that reforestation site where they had the mangrove nursery ended up dissipating. People stopped volunteering for it, and that project no longer exists. But backtracking a little, the values that are ascribed to mangroves by the community and the association of the resources with women seems to validate the participation of women in reforestation projects, right? These top two have essentially all women, except for one man who participates in the first one. And the specialized knowledge and the experience of the extractors also seems to contribute to their ability to make informed decisions about where and when to reforest. Not all women, however, are involved in reforestation, and men and women who are already involved in associations seem to have more consistent access to participation in the 3 projects that I described. In interviews, men express an interest in wanting to participate more in reforestation activities. They believe that it could help them learn more about the mangroves themselves and make them better fishermen. However, both men and women describe men's time as being inflexible. The work of fishers was dictated by tides. Both men and women described men as needing to work more time at sea than before, to produce enough income. This resonates more with families that have only one fisher. Often wives and husbands or parents and children may fish together, and this could lead them to have more flexibility with their time, but this is unclear. Some women have participated multiple times or for consistent periods in reforestation projects, and some women are perceived to be more outspoken or more experienced from participation. A conversation with an NGO described that some activities are dictated by donor funds, which is not and it is not uncommon that funds are specified for use with women and women's projects. So some women have found greater access to some resources, but not all women are empowered the same. In the community, some past women's leadership was received with some critique, and NGOs are cautious to appoint specific leaders, although among smaller groups within associations, some leaders may emerge. In the past, projects, women were excluded because work was viewed as being too physically demanding, and this exclusion caused some tension between women and men, and volunteer participation depleted or ended. Participation on gender roles and identities ascribed by use make women's participation in projects seem like a right fit. In the community, it's not uncommon to hear stories about women looking to the mangroves for subsistence when food and funds are scarce. For organizations and agencies working with reforestation groups, they view women's time as being more flexible and women as less conflicted than men. This is from a quote from an interview that I did. So thinking about these NGOs and their influences or partner influences with people that are working in the community, from the sample of participants, associated individuals, both men and women, reported greater participation in trainings and more interaction with groups that were thought to be in charge of the resources. So from interview responses, more women reported participating in mangrove-focused trainings and access to workshops off of the island with government, NGO stakeholders, and other similar groups from other communities in Costa Rica. Women also reported participating in different trainings sponsored by the Ministry of Labor, the Institute of Social Assistance, on topics like food handling, nutrition, and entrepreneurship. One specific group, INAMO, which is the National Institute for Women, did target women during trainings. However, these trainings were not related to natural resources. Most trainings that were focused on mangroves and mangrove resources were done by environmental government institutions or NGOs that were already working on conservation in the island. So I just want to focus on this chart on the top. I asked the question of whether individuals were participating in training or capacity building. And this is data from all three communities. So it seemed that if you were associated, you were more likely to participate in training or capacity building. So I haven't finished analyzing this, this is all in progress still, but I'm kind of leaning towards thinking that access to training can also be based on individual access to information and availability to attend meetings. A number of individuals said that they wish that they had participated more, but they were not able to find out about opportunities to participate until after they had passed. Finally, I want to point out that many in the community believe that it was important to include young people because they believe that young people participating in reforestation may remove them from some activities that they thought were harmful, like drug use. So thinking about perceptions in the community about restoration and the results of restoration. When asked, women and men in the different communities believe that forest cover seems to have increased in the last 5 years. That's the first chart on the top. This next one here, I asked individuals to describe how happy they were with the progress of restoration. This was a Likert scale question, so they had to mark from 5 being the highest, low being the lowest being 1, how they perceived their progress, the progress of restoration. The majority of people indicated that the progress was within a 4 and a 5, so they seem to be pretty happy with the way things are going. And those that viewed mangroves as having particular benefits or being beneficial, the reforestation of them being beneficial, mentioned that these were some of the reasons that they thought reforestation was important. So they viewed it as bringing more mollusks, bringing more fish, more production. So economically, it was important for them. They also included really interesting and very specific benefits that they perceived, such as it being better for families, there being specific economic benefits for women. They also mentioned ecological benefits, so there would be more biodiversity, an increase of different animals, more refuges, and they also viewed it as including more opportunities. So they viewed the reforestation projects as bringing more subsidies, greater opportunity for the future. And the key findings for the research so far, spaces across the island are gendered, as in the maps that were made by the communities. Mangrove restoration has been ongoing for 10 years, and it's been punctuated by inputs from external organizations. Women's participation in restoration is more dominant. Many women have diversified from traditional fisheries. There's a number of women and also men that are participating in aquaculture projects. However, women seem to be more dominant in these as well. And connections to politically and legally recognized associations, such as fishing associations or extractive associations, seem to be a prerequisite to access and participate in management on the island. I want to thank my committee and also Melissa for helping me do some of the research for the first part. That's it. Thank you.